morning, everybody. Welcome to Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber, and you might be saying to yourself, things look a little different. And you know why that is? That is because we have a brand new set here that we're very excited to show you and present to you during the course of this program. So take a look, take it all in. We're going to be presenting here on our new set, but that's not the only thing that we have to talk about today because there's a lot to cover. So let's get started right now. First up, we are going to be covering the Denise Williams verdict. You know we've been covering this trial for the past week or so. Denise Williams was on trial for conspiracy, accessory after the fact, and murder in connection with the disappearance of her husband, Mike Williams, 18 years ago. And I will tell you, we were waiting for the verdict, and we got it Friday. Denise Williams was found guilty across the board. And we are going to recap this entire trial for you. And a little bit later on in the program, in about the 11 o'clock hour, we are going to interview Ethan Way, Denise Williams' defense attorney. He's the one who presented that really powerful closing argument, so you're not going to want to miss that. But that is not the only thing that we're covering here on Law&Crime today. We are also going to be covering the Jason Van Dyke trial. You knew we were back there later last week. Jason Van Dyke, who was found guilty of second-degree murder and 16 counts of aggravated assault in connection with aggravated battery, in connection with the shooting death of Laquan McDonald. Well, that was a feed in courtroom last week. Looks a lot different than he did in his trial. His defense attorneys tried to make a push to have that guilty verdict thrown out and for a new trial to be granted. The judge denied those motions and set a sentencing date for January 18th. That's right, he may have been found guilty, but he hasn't been sentenced yet. And here on the network, we're going to cover what potential options face him and what maybe prison sentence he could face. You're not going to want to miss that. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in the program. But right now, our main focus at the beginning part is going to be the Denise Williams trial. Now, if anybody doesn't know anything about it, let's start from the very beginning with the prosecution's opening statement. Okay, so that was the prosecution's opening statement in the Denise Williams trial. Let's break down the entirety of this case, and we are starting from the beginning, but we want to understand why did the jury reach their verdict? And helping me this morning is a very special guest, the first guest on our brand new set, Law&Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. Jonna, welcome.
Jesse, this is fantastic, isn't it?
It's pretty cool, right? Well, it's all due to our great engineers and producers who were able to make this happen. But we got to focus right now, though, on the Denise Williams trial. Let's get back to work here.
Yep.
Found guilty. I have to think you were surprised by this because based upon your comments last week, you didn't think this was going to happen.
So I was here on Friday, and I really didn't think it was going to happen. I certainly didn't believe that there was going to be a verdict across the board. I thought maybe they might try to get her on something, maybe some of the lesser charges, because if she didn't get convicted of this crime, essentially nobody would be doing time for the murder of her husband.
But that shouldn't have guided their decision, right? We need justice for Mike, so someone should be found guilty.
It shouldn't guide their decision, but, you know, jurors are human beings, Jesse. And this was a cold, calculated murder. And I don't think, 12 people sitting in a jury box are going to take it very well if nobody essentially gets punished for something that heinous.
Well, Ethan Way, who was one of the defense attorneys for Denise Williams, made that point in his closing argument that this isn't about finding justice for Mike. This is about seeing who is responsible for this crime and that Denise Williams should be found not guilty. We're going to interview him a little bit later on in the program, and I'm going to ask him these kinds of questions because, according to him, he doesn't believe she had anything to do with Mike Williams' murder. But I want to play a little bit more of the prosecution's opening statement. Again, we're recapping the entire trial so you can understand how the jury ultimately reached their verdict. Take a look. Okay, that's the prosecutor explaining a little more of the backstory of the Mike Williams disappearance and murder. Jonna, you got to tell me, with this guilty verdict, though, clearly the jury felt, what was it, you think? Was it more the idea that she filed for that insurance claim 19 days after he went missing? Was it the fact that she was cheating on Mike Williams before with Brian Winchester, the fact that she stayed with him and married him? Clearly they held on to something about her, because you and I have both talked about there seemed to be a lack of evidence about the planning of the murder, but she clearly benefited from at the end. So what do you think they attached to?
So this case was a little unusual because historically, there have been love triangles where the two that are newly in love decide to plot and plan to kill the third wheel, right? But typically you don't have one of them coming out and saying, yep, I did it, and I did it because we planned it together. This was unusual in that we had Brian Winchester admitting to being the killer and pulling the defendant in, saying, wait a minute, we planned and plotted this together. And because the jury had not only that testimony, but the fact that she married the guy. She married him. I bet you if we could talk to the jurors, they'd say that really stuck in their craw.
But isn't this a question of not that she knew about this, that he did this, but when she knew about this? Because isn't it entirely plausible and reasonable that she found out about this murder after the fact and not before? Yes,
and in fact, in the defense's closing argument, he basically said, this wasn't a plot and plan between the two of them. This was a confession by Brian Winchester to her. And and I think, but the jurors must not have bought that because they convicted her anyway.
After 8 hours of deliberations, they came back with that guilty verdict. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we have a lot more to talk about. Okay, that's the beginning part of the defense's opening statement in the Denise Williams trial. Jonna, were you getting the sense that they were trying to say, look, how can you even show that there's an affair going on here? Is that what you were getting, and is that the best argument to make?
Actually, what I got out of his opening statement was that the defense was hanging their hat on one thing, Jesse, and that is the credibility of the confessed murderer, which is kind of risky, right? Because if they do actually end up believing him, then your theory of the defense is out the window, as we now know is probably what happened here. So it was a little bit of a risk to say, you can't believe this guy. And if you're going to say don't believe this guy, maybe you should also put the defendant on to counter his testimony so that there is, to create the reasonable doubt if somebody were inclined to believe him.
They didn't put her on the stand. Do you think that was a mistake or not?
Well, you know, now that we're Monday morning quarterbacking, but it probably would have helped because he must have come across as credible. They convicted her. So if she got on the stand and also came across as credible, maybe even one person might not have said, look, I can't convict her.
Well, the defense did make some good arguments. Let's continue on with their opening statement. All right, that's a little bit more of the defense's opening statement. Jonna, one of the things that we keep talking about is the Brian Winchester immunity deal.
Right.
Have you ever seen an immunity deal quite like this, that he says he shot Mike Williams in the face and he cannot be charged with that crime?
Well, I mean, that's the beauty of immunity. And look, for the prosecution here, without his confession, I suppose they would have had nothing, and this crime could have remained unsolved forever and ever. And, you know, it just so happened it was a perfect storm because Mr. Winchester was facing other criminal charges, and that's how you exact confessions and information about crimes and grant immunity. That's the whole reason why a prosecution would be interested in doing it.
But if they couldn't get a successful guilty verdict here, in this case against Denise Williams, then they would have to come to the reality that no one would be held responsible for Mike Williams' murder. Is that an error? Would that have been an error on the part of the state to grant that kind of deal?
You know, ordinarily I would say yes, but look, this case was old, Jesse. This is like an 18-year-old case, right? So the prosecution probably said, let's roll these dice because we don't have a whole lot to lose. This crime remained unsolved for almost 20 years. This is our one bite at the apple. Let's go for it. And it works.
Do you think if Brian Winchester was not put on the stand, they would have enough evidence to convict her?
Oh, heck no. No. What would they have? They wouldn't have anything, essentially. And she would get away with becoming rich off the murder of her husband. And that's the other thing, Jesse. I think the jury's probably upset that she did not go to the police when he confessed to her.
Wow. Pretty fascinating details in this case. Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we have a lot more to talk about in the Denise Williams trial. One of the things the jury heard was the frantic efforts by friends and family of Mike Williams to try to find him when he disappeared back in 2000. And Jonna, one of the most amazing things about this case is that Mike Williams' mother never gave up hope. She wasn't convinced that he drowned and was eaten by alligators in Lake Seminole. She felt there was something more nefarious going on, and it's because of her that we ultimately see the people who were responsible for this.
Yeah, I know. Well, you know, if your mother never wants to give up, right? No matter what. We've seen that historically too. But I think it is odd that they almost immediately found items belonging to the victim here, but never any remnants of a body. I mean, that is in and of itself, Jesse, very suspicious.
Isn't it amazing that the body was not discovered until Brian Winchester came forward to police and said,
right,
I know who did this, I did it, along with Denise, and I can show you the body. That's what made him a very credible witness.
Well, he obviously had corroboration for his own confession. And here's just a little fun fact. You need to, in order to get convicted of any crime, you need to have more than a person's confession. You have to have some evidence that corroborates it. Obviously, we had it here because he could show them exactly where the body was and the skeletal remains. Here's
the most legally strange part about this case. So he was convicted of armed kidnapping of Denise, faced life in prison, but he made this plea deal, so now he's only going to serve maybe, 20 years in prison? So the trigger man will eventually be released from prison if he survives that long. She will most likely spend the rest of her life in prison, and she was the one who planned it, plotted it, but wasn't there when the actual shooting took place. Can you explain this to our viewers, how this makes sense?
Yeah, so in the eyes of the law, forget for the moment that he made a deal so that he doesn't spend the rest of his life in prison. In the eyes of the law, when you conspire with somebody to commit any crime, but especially a crime as heinous as murder, you are as guilty as the person who pulls the trigger or, hits him in the head with the shovel or does anything that brings about the death because you conspired to do it. You don't get a pass in the eyes of the law, and that's exactly why she was convicted and why she will serve her life in prison.
Wow, fast. Pretty incredible stuff. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to dive a little bit more into the testimony that you may have missed, so stay tuned here on Law and Crime. So this guy recovered the missing waders that were worn by Mike Williams when he disappeared. Jonna, the thing that's interesting about this whole discovery is their original plan was to drown Mike Williams. According to Brian Winchester, that was the plan. And when that went afoul, he shot him in the face. Can you get more evil than that?
Well, especially when this man was his friend, right? They were BFFs for a long time, which makes it especially heinous. But I guess, they spent a lot of time with this witness, and I was curious as to why, and I guess they want to put the pieces together about the planning, because we already know they admitted he's dead. Like, it's not a question that this was indeed a murder. Why are we spending so much time on recovering the waders from the water?
It could be that they want to corroborate the testimony of Brian Winchester and show that what he's telling the jury is accurate. Let's play now Alton Raynew. Now, this is from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Department. Remember, there was a big investigation, a search, to find Mike Williams. Let's listen to this testimony. So they found the waders, but they couldn't find Mike Williams until his remains were found 17 years later when Brian Winchester led authorities to Mike's body. So you're looking at this and you're thinking about this, Jonna, about how this investigation happened, and we're listening to these small details. What we just talked about, though, isn't this a way to corroborate Brian Winchester's testimony? Because he said, look, we put him in the waders, we wanted to drown him, that didn't work. Ended up shooting him. The more that you can show this evidence, right, the more it shows, hey, you should believe Brian Winchester.
Well, since that was the entire theory of the prosecution's case, rested on the believability of Brian Winchester. So every little piece of testimony or evidence that supports that eventually would help the prosecution, yes. And plus, I mean, it makes sense. They tried to make this murder look like a simple accident. And the waders and the flashlight and all that stuff goes along with it. The only thing that was missing here was the actual body. And you would think, Jesse, that you'd find some portion of his body in the water close in time to when he disappeared.
What does it say about investigations, though, that we would have never found Mike's body or what happened to him if it wasn't for the murderer?
Back then, technology wasn't as it is exactly today. But we need it in a crime like this. Both of these people would have gotten away with murder, but for the fact that Brian Winchester committed another crime and decided to help himself by fessing up.
And we see that a lot, right? People get convicted or get implicated in other crimes, and then they give information about unsolved mysteries.
Oh, you know how many people, you have jailhouse confessions all the time, people trying to get information on their cellmates to help them in their present case. It's part of our system of justice, like it or not.
And here it worked. I mean, it was credible. They wouldn't have found Mike, you have to presume they wouldn't have found Mike's body if it wasn't for Brian. And speaking of Brian, when we come back from our break, we're going to play you the testimony of Brian Winchester. As Jonna Spilbor and I have been talking about all this morning, the prosecution's whole case rested on the testimony of that man. And whether you like him, you hate him, whatever it is, everything was built upon what he said. And you know who he tries to throw under the bus, Denise Williams. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk more about the Denise Williams trial. All right, so that was Michael Devaney, a former FDLE agent who investigated the Mike Williams disappearance and the investigation into Denise Williams. I want to break this down right now with Law&Crime trial analyst Jonna Spilbor. She's back with us. So what are they trying to get at there? We saw a little bit with the defense trying to poke holes, I believe, in the investigation, saying that they could have done more. Then what was the prosecutor trying to do?
I guess what the prosecutor here is trying to do is dispel the defense theory that Denise Williams basically was as innocent as you or me and really had nothing to do with the commission of this crime, didn't commit an overt act, and really was just the recipient of a confession by her then ex-husband, or soon-to-be husband, I guess, at the time. And that's the whole job of, excuse me, the prosecution, is to bolster Brian Winchester's credibility and to discredit the notion that Denise Williams had absolutely nothing to do with this.
One of the things the defense attorney was trying to get out of this witness under cross-examination was there was really no tangible evidence connecting Denise to the murder of Mike Williams. Yet we all know that jury just came back and convicted her across the board. So when you're looking for reasonable doubt, wasn't it there?
Well, the jury must have believed, pardon me, the testimony of Brian Winchester, hook, line, and sinker, because that's really the only way, Jesse, that they could come to the conclusion that they did and convict.
Have you ever seen a case where literally one witness's testimony is what's decided, the deciding factor?
Well, look at it this way. Is it unusual to have one witness be the linchpin in a prosecution? Yes, but this was not a case, a murder that happened yesterday. This was an 18-year-old murder case with enough evidence to show that there was a relationship between the defendant and the triggerman. Not just a relationship, they married each other. And I think if you're sitting on the jury box, you're not going to believe that she was just this innocent, oh, I'm sorry, did you kill my ex-husband? Let's go have lunch. Like, that could not have happened.
But it's a question of when did she know about this? Because I know a lot of people probably say, well, she clearly knew that Brian Winchester killed Mike Williams, but did she know that that was the plan beforehand, or did she know about it after? Because isn't it reasonable to assume he does the killing, comes back, I killed Mike, now we can be together and you can collect on the insurance, and she said, okay. That's
a great question, and which is probably why they also charged her as an accessory after the fact, as well as a principal in the murder. Because, I suppose the jury could have came back and said, all right, she was an accessory after the fact, but she wasn't a murderer. But they didn't do that.
Now, she could have faced life in prison for any of those charges. So, in other words, what you're saying is the prosecution put everything down. They said maybe she planned it, maybe she was a part of it, or she at least covered it up.
Yes. And the jury said, check, 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 all three.
You think the prosecutor was even surprised by the check, check, check?
He might have been. He might have been.
Because it was a lot. And I know we had talked about, we're talking about it now, holes in the investigation. How can you definitively say
that there was no reasonable doubt?
Right, that she was the principal. Because, But then a lot of times we're looking at this case from the outside and we're saying she cheated on her husband. Clearly she benefited from it by getting that almost $2 million in life insurance.
Yes.
So you and I talking, and a lot of the viewers probably thought she had something to do with it. But if you're sitting in that jury, it's a different standard.
Yes, and I agree with that. I actually didn't think the jury was going to come back with a murder conviction, only because there seemed to have been reasonable doubt, Jesse. You have to believe the words of a liar and a confessed murderer in order to do what the jury did.
I'll tell you what, when we come back, because we're going to take a break right now, let's play you the testimony of Brian Winchester. We'll be right back. They had a connection. How sweet is that? Now, Jonna, the idea of them cheating, how much did that play into the jury's verdict decision? I mean, the idea that she was cheating on her husband with this guy who eventually shot her husband. I mean, the idea of cheating, how much does that play into this case?
You know, Jesse, I think part of that is to make the jury not like her, to make the jury think that she is totally capable of lying, since she was lying to her husband and, you know, lying to her friend, well, even though her friend might have been in on some of this. I think it's to make her look essentially like a bad person. So we weren't there for voir dire, but I'm sure that these issues came up when they were questioning jurors to see how they felt about
Is it fair to say,
like
hey, somebody cheats, they know how to cover something up, that means they know how to cover up a murder?
You know, that's the implication. The jury needed to know that she was not an innocent person. She was no Mother Teresa. She was capable of cheating on her husband. She was capable of lying about that. She was capable of covering that up. So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she was capable of covering up her role in this crime.
All right, let's play a little bit more of Brian Winchester, because he really is the prosecution's star witness. Take a look. And he's throwing the love of his life underneath the bus. Love's complicated, isn't it, Jonna?
Yeah, it is, especially when you eventually kidnap the one that you love and get sentenced to 20 years for it.
How do you think he's doing on the stand? Like, looking at his demeanor, the way he's speaking, does he seem credible?
Right. So, you know, as credible as a confessed murderer can seem, I think what he's doing right now is he's establishing that this was not a one-sided thing. It wasn't just him lusting after Denise. Denise was very much into this relationship, and therefore the leap can be made that she must have wanted her husband dead just as much as he did.
Yeah, I mean, really, you said it before, and you'll say it again. It all is based on his testimony. And I guess the idea is, why would he confess? He knew where the body was. Clearly, he knew what happened to Mike, and why shouldn't we believe him? So why shouldn't we believe him?
Well, first of all, he's a confessed murderer. Second of all, he's also a confessed felon because he kidnapped his ex-wife. And, you know, look, he's got an incentive to make sure he gives the prosecution what they want, Jesse, because if he doesn't, he can kiss his immunity deal goodbye.
I want to talk about that. If they caught him in a lie, if what he was saying was not true, he could face murder charges. Is that the way I understand it?
Yeah, in any immunity deal, it doesn't give you carte blanche to say whatever you want, whether it's helpful or not. You have to pretty much stay on script and be truthful. Otherwise, you could lose that immunity deal.
Let me ask you this. If you're her defense counsel, do you go back to his testimony and try to find evidence moving forward that he lied on the stand?
If I'm the defense counsel and I'm going to file an appeal, or if I'm the defense counsel during the trial?
I don't even know. I'm saying you're upset that, I mean, if you're representing Denise Williams, the whole case was made by this guy. Do you go back and say, wait a second, I want to revisit his testimony and see if he was accurate?
Well, and that probably is what the defense needs to do, because the jury believed what he said. And if they didn't, she wouldn't be looking at life in prison.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this after our next break, because when we come back, it's more of Brian Winchester. Okay, a lot of details to dissect there. I want to start, Jonna, just with that religious aspect.
Yeah.
That's weird, the idea that, oh, what Mike's fake is going to be, it's not in our hands. What do you make of that?
That was just him or her trying to justify their soon-to-be very bad behavior. But you know what else I'm noticing from his testimony, Jesse? Like, this is where the rubber meets the road. When he's testifying as to all this plotting and planning that they did as lovers, why did she not take the stand and say, he's out of his mind, those conversations never happened, I had no idea, just to create the reasonable doubt that obviously wasn't created without her testimony?
But realistically, if she went on the stand, she could have been destroyed. Under cross-examination. I
am not so sure, and I know, hopefully you'll ask that question today, why she didn't take the stand, because, look, if it's true, of course you'd have to testify truthfully. If she could take the stand and say, none of those conversations happened, I didn't know what happened to him until he confessed to me sometime later, and then where she might have been destroyed is if the prosecution or the defense said to her, why didn't you go to the police when you found out what would she say? Like, boo? Like, I don't know what she was going to say to that.
That's a great point. And we can't forget, trials aren't really about the truth. It's not about what really happened. It's about convincing that jury, can you believe this guy? Can you believe Brian Winchester? Can you poke holes in his testimony? Speaking of which, let's play more of his testimony, and John and I will break it down. Okay, I want to break down more of Brian Winchester's testimony. Do you think the defense did a strong enough job at saying to the jury, you shouldn't believe this guy? Because really, at the end of the day, we can't forget his incentive to lie. He did have a real strong incentive because he could have been facing life in prison for that armed kidnapping charge. He's going to be facing 20 years in prison now. He's not going to be charged with Mike Williams' murder. So he had an incentive, but it clearly maybe wasn't stressed enough for the jury, or they just said, you know what? We believe him.
No, obviously not, right? Because they convicted her across the board. So again, I think hindsight is always 20/20, and you never know. When you put a defendant on the stand, it's not a slam dunk that a jury is going to come back in your favor. It never is, right? But in this case, I think she really could have done a lot of damage to him, to Winchester's testimony, by simply getting up there and saying, it didn't happen. You can look at me askance for being a cheater. You can look at me askance for, cheating on my husband. You can look at me askance because I cashed in the insurance policy 3 weeks after he went missing, but I didn't have anything to do with killing him.
And that's why she was charged with accessory after the fact, because of how much she benefited. But what did he gain from it? Yes, he'll talk a little bit more about how he wasn't on that life insurance policy, but by virtue of being with Denise, yeah, he was kind of like a secondary benefit to that. But the question is, he killed his best friend just to be with Denise Williams. Is that strong enough for you?
See, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, though, Jesse, because apparently these two were hot and heavy while Mike Williams was very much alive, right? And so it didn't seem to stop them. It was almost like it was part of their lifestyle. So Denise Williams could have said, this was not my idea at all. A switch flipped in his head, and he went off on his own and concocted this plan.
Yeah, it's details are very difficult to understand and explain, but we are trying to do that because of the guilty verdict from last week. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to play more of Brian Winchester's testimony. How could we not? He was the star witness, and really the whole case was made or broken based upon his testimony. Let's take a quick break. You are hearing him describing the moments he shot Mike Williams in the face. John, I want to ask you straight up, what's your reaction to listening to this and watching him?
It's really gut-wrenching, Jesse. And if you're in that jury box and you hear that, and you know in the back of your mind that he's not going to get any time for killing this man, and that had to factor in to their verdict here.
Do you believe him? Is the emotion helping his story? Is it hurting? I know we always try to see the demeanor of a witness, especially one like this. What do you think?
I don't think he's garnering any sympathy in this case from the fact that he's crying and, he's describing how upset he was when he shot his friend in the face. Because the bottom line is he shot his friend in the face. So I don't think the jury's feeling any sympathy for him, and probably that is being transferred on to the defendant here, who's on trial for the actual murder.
You made a good point in break, and I want you to bring it up again about the idea of we're talking about whether the defense will have a successful appeal. What was your reaction to that?
So this is something interesting to me. The jury found her guilty of being basically a principal in the crime of murder and being an accessory after the fact. To me, those two don't jive. Either you're a principal or you're an accessory. You can't be both. That could be a ground for appeal. All
right, we'll talk more about that in a second. Let's play you the verdict from Friday in case you haven't seen it. Take a look. Jonna, what is that like to sit there and your client was just found guilty after so much time of putting on this case? What is that feeling like?
They didn't show very much emotion there, but you prepare yourself and you prepare your client for that very real possibility, because you never know what a jury is going to do. So you simply say, if the worst case scenario happens, we'll deal with it. But that's all you can do. And
what about a successful appeal? You talked a little bit more about it. I'm curious, what are the grounds they could get a successful appeal here?
Well, like I said, the one ground is I think that they could argue that the verdict was basically incongruent, because you can't be an accessory and be a principal of a crime, right? If you're a principal, you're a principal, accessory. So that's one. Plus, if there were any, during the trial, if there were any evidentiary rulings that came back unfavorable to the defendant that should have been favorable, those types of things can get appealed. So all may not be lost for Denise Williams.
So after our next break, I'm going to be interviewing Ethan Way, her defense attorney, the one who delivered that closing argument. What would you like to know from that defense counsel?
Thank you. Please ask him why he didn't put her on the stand.
That was one of my questions, because
Yes.
you felt that the case could have been changed if she went on the stand.
I think so, unless he knows something that we don't, in which case he might not be able to answer us. But, he may know something that we don't, but I would like to know what he
In other words, if you had her and him fighting it out about the facts, that could be reasonable doubt.
That could have easily created reasonable doubt, at least for one juror. And then you're not looking at a conviction, you're looking at a mistrial, which in some cases, Jesse, is a win.
Because they might not retry her.
Well, they might not, or there's some negotiation that can happen after that, before a retrial. So at least you're not a convicted murderer.
You might have mentioned this before. Were you surprised that it took the jury 8 hours to come back with a verdict?
I thought that was a little quick, and I'm really surprised that this was a verdict across the board. I really did. I thought they were going to mix and match if they were going to find anything.
But at the end of the day, any one of those charges could have been life in prison.
Yes, exactly. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another in terms of Denise Williams. But yeah, and she was pretty stoic while the verdict was read.
And what do you think about her, Mike Williams' family? This was a long journey for them, and now they have some sort of a conclusion.
Not only relief, Jesse, but when something like this happens to a loved one, you want justice more than you want anything else. And they probably finally feel like they have it.
I wonder if they feel that it would have been better if both Brian Winchester and Denise Williams were behind bars for the rest of their life. That's not the way that it worked, but they did have some sort of answer. Jonna Spilbor, thanks for coming on and being our first guest on our brand new set.
So happy. Thanks for having me.
Of course. All right, everybody. When we come back, we have a very special guest for you. I'm going to tell you one more time. Joining us is going to be Ethan Way, the defense attorney for Denise Williams. So stay tuned here on Law and Crime.